Some of the most popular and profitable intellectual properties in the history of entertainment hail from the science fiction genre. You've probably got a few examples of the standouts of this genre coming to mind already. Sci-fi can take us to unseen worlds, show us creatures beyond our imagination, and give us action on an intergalactic scale. Personally, I find that the greatest examples of sci-fi are those that can go beyond the lightsabers, phasers, and spaceships and explore what the absolute best of these stories can do. Simply showing us something that is beyond our understanding can help us to better understand ourselves. The sentiment to explore these themes was always there, but the genre had to struggle for a long time to find the respect that it has nowadays. For a long time, sci-fi couldn't shake the pulpy image that it had cultivated through years of monthly magazine publications and short stories that focused on otherworldly alien horrors and laser battles. There was much more to many of these stories, the metaphor beneath the surface being lost on mainstream audiences who just didn't catch the socio-political commentary or look deeper into the religious themes behind extraterrestrials. In the 60s, the genre saw a massive boom in mainstream popularity on television with shows like The Twilight Zone and the original Star Trek series. Both were presented very differently. The Twilight Zone being an anthology with its most classic episodes being categorized as science fiction, but also featuring elements of fantasy and horror. Star Trek went all the way. Its massive cult following still persists today, with many of its visual and story elements being referenced or parodied all across pop culture. While both series seem very different on the surface, they both had some things in common, and I'm not just talking about William Shatner. Both series had episodes that addressed deeper themes and challenged social issues in the 1960s, a decade where cultural ideology was rapidly shifting. Some elements of both shows are incredibly dated now, especially in Star Trek, but the best of the best episodes are remembered for what they had to say more than what they showed, and these episodes came from the mind of writer Jerome Bixby. California native Jerome Bixby was a highly influential figure in the world of science fiction writing. He was a prolific writer for science fiction magazines starting in the 1950s, publishing many short stories and eventually venturing into screenwriting. In 1958, he wrote the screenplay for the independent sci-fi horror film It, The Terror from Beyond Space. The film, featuring a Martian that sneaks aboard a spaceship and murders the crew one by one, was cited by screenwriter Dan O'Bannon as the inspiration for Ridley Scott's classic Alien. Continuing his influence in the 60s, Bixby would write 4 episodes of the original Star Trek series, one of which, Mirror Mirror, an episode that explores the concept of a mirror universe, is continually cited by fans as one of the absolute best of the series. Before his work on Star Trek, one of his short stories was adapted by Rod Serling into an episode of The Twilight Zone entitled It's a Good Life, also considered one of the greatest episodes of that series. As the 60s came to a close, the mainstream started to shift in its attitude toward the science fiction genre, with the help of theatrical films that pushed the medium further. Stanley Kubrick would prove once and for all that the genre was capable of something so much more when he released 2001: A Space Odyssey. It certainly had the look of a genre film, but felt like something daring and new. It tackled themes like the marriage of religion and extraterrestrial influence, the dangers of artificial intelligence, and the next step in human evolution. While the innovative special effects dazzled, it was the themes that kept people talking about 2001. In the 70s, Russian filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky sought to bring a more emotional depth to the sci-fi that Kubrick had broken new ground with, and produced 2 of his most renowned works, the sci-fi drama films Solaris and Stalker. Both films were more concerned with the emotions felt by the characters than the worlds that they lived in. Stalker specifically doesn't even resemble a science fiction film at all on a visual level, and is very, very slow moving, but the conversation between the characters and the implications of its ending make it one of the most unique films in the genre. I think Jerome Bixby must have seen works like this and became inspired to create something similar. A work that didn't rely on set pieces or special effects to tell a profound story about the human condition, about our reactions when we're confronted with things that science can't yet explain, and even touches on the meaning of existence and the purpose of that existence. That's where we come to the film I'm going to talk about right now. An underrated independent film from one of the greatest science fiction writers of his time. One that he was so invested in that he worked on it for decades, finally completing it on his deathbed. This is The Man from Earth. The first thing you'll notice about The Man from Earth from the clips that I'm showing you now is that it is very low budget. Without looking it up, I would have guessed that it was a made-for-television film released in the mid-90s, but you may be surprised to know that The Man from Earth was theatrically released in October of 2007, before being made available on home video a month later. This film flew under the radar for many that year, but actually gained a bit of popularity online through peer-to-peer file-sharing networks, leading to the producer to actually thank the users of BitTorrent for illegally sharing the movie, thus making it more popular than it would have been. With that low budget considered, it's important to note that this is not a perfect movie by any means. The camera quality is very rough, especially in low light. The audio indoors is alright, but anything shot outside is so obviously dubbed, it's hilarious.
My God! Well, what is this? It looks like a Van Gogh, but I've never seen it before.
And the acting, while very good, feels reminiscent of a TV movie or a stage play. As a matter of fact, the director, Richard Shankman, would later adapt the film into a theatrical production in 2012. The reason the acting and staging is the way that it is likely due to the way that the film was written. This was a passion project for Jerome Bixby, having begun writing it in the 1960s before finishing it in April of 1998, dictating the last pages of it to his son Emerson to write for him before he passed away. Because of the way that this film was made, you get a weird mixture of dialogue that sounds like the 60s and quality that looks like 90s TV in a movie that came out in the 2000s. It's this strange presentation that's one of the reasons I find it so fascinating to watch. The other reason, of course, being its fantastic story. John Oldman is a professor who is packing up and moving away without telling any of his friends why he's leaving or where he's going. Said friends, all colleagues of his at university, basically ambush him and force him into what they hope to be a nice evening of farewells over a few drinks. Each of his friends have distinct personalities, beliefs, and expertise in their respective fields, but the one thing that they all have in common is their curiosity as to why John is suddenly leaving them behind with no explanation after 10 years of working together. Eventually, John drops the meteor-sized bomb on them that the reason for his departure is that he is an immortal 14,000-year-old caveman. John explains to his amused guests that he travels all over the world, building lives for himself for 10 years at a time until he chooses to move on as soon as evidence will begin to show of his immortality, mainly that he doesn't age.
Every 10 years or so, when people start to notice I don't age, I move on.
The rest of the film is the conversations that result from this realization, as his colleagues begin to change from simply humoring John, allowing him to tell a story that they believe to be either a prank or basis for a book, to slowly coming to their own conclusions on whether or not he's telling the truth. So do we as an audience. The genius of this screenplay comes from the way that John reveals this information to his friends and their reaction to those reveals. A lesser writer would have had John simply start revealing knowledge that none of them could have known or showing off artifacts that he's collected from years of existence. But Bixby's script is so much smarter than that. John has memories of the long life that he's lived, but they aren't vivid. His long life may be extraordinary, but his ability to recall is entirely ordinary. He knows that he was present for major historical events because he read about them and remembered being there. His explanation of this to the other characters is what makes it so difficult for them to believe him. At one point early on in the story, one of the characters notices an artifact that John has in his living room, and on my first watch, I assumed that John would reveal that he kept it from thousands of years ago, but that's not what happens.
Would you have some relic, an artifact, reminded of your early life?
Thrift shop. Really?
Interesting. You could have lied about that.
The doubt that all of the characters have in their minds is transferred to the audience, because as good as John is at telling his story, he doesn't provide a ton of evidence outside of his extensive knowledge, and considering that he's a history professor, it makes that knowledge seem studied rather than gained through experience. John's recounting of his supposed life story is the driving force of The Man from Earth, and actor David Lee Smith plays this character very well. He does such a good job here that it makes me kinda sad that he's not as well known in the mainstream, having had small appearances on television as well as Fight Club and even Zodiac, which was released the same year as The Man from Earth. Smith's performance works not just because of how well he delivers these stories, but also because of the emotions he's able to communicate while telling them. You can tell there's a sense of relief that comes over him as he speaks. Yeah, he knows that they probably won't believe him, but he's just happy to finally be able to tell his friends who he really is, or believes he is. When the group confronts him on why he chose to tell them all of this, he says it's because he wanted to say goodbye to them as his true self, showing just how fond he's become of them. John's friends are the other essential element that makes this film work. All of them are intellectuals: Dan the anthropologist, Harry the biologist, Art the archaeologist and his student Linda, Sandy the historian, and Edith the art historian. The way each of them skeptically analyze John's story varies on the level of severity with which they take his claims. Art is the most seriously doubtful of John, becoming angrily concerned early on and calling in a psychiatry professor named Dr. Will Gruber to come to the house and analyze John's mental state.
Surely you remember your father.
I seem to remember a figure.
Well, no matter. I could scarcely remember mine.
As the story continues, all of the characters truly start to believe what John is saying, although some won't outright admit it. As they begin to believe, they start to ask more personal questions, moving beyond just curiosity about historical events and into how John actually lives his life. John claims to have had several relationships and fathered many children, but never stayed long enough to watch them grow old and die, causing the pain of abandonment but avoiding the pain of having to acknowledge outliving everyone around him. This description of his solitary lifestyle really gets to Sandy, who is in love with John. There's compelling drama in these conversations, and it's important to note that that's all this film is. It takes a page out of films like Stalker, where gripping sci-fi doesn't have to have the familiar aesthetics of sci-fi to exist. This film takes place entirely in John's house, and we never see anything remotely supernatural occur. The draw of this movie is its writing. This also isn't the first time that Bixby has done something like this. His short story, It's a Good Life, takes place in the home of a young boy who has godlike powers and essentially keeps his entire family at his mercy. Adults are brought to their knees by the whims and wants of a child. One extraordinary person being in a room full of normal people. This isn't the first time Bixby tackled the concept of immortality either. One of his Star Trek episodes, Requiem for Methuselah, features a 6,000-year-old man that lived lifetimes as well-known people in history. The Man from Earth is very similar in concept, but allows its themes to be explored through intellectual discussions rather than the spectacle of mainstream sci-fi. It's from these discussions that we get an image of just how sad of an existence this man lives if he's telling the truth. The pain of immortality is shown so clearly here that the film definitely makes it out as a curse, made even more clear when John questions why he's the only one like this that he knows of, even saying that he used to think he was cursed back when he had those beliefs. And it's with that discussion of beliefs that we get into heavy spoiler territory for The Man from Earth. I highly encourage you to watch this movie before watching this section of the video if it interests you at all. And you can watch it right now because, as of recording this, The Man from Earth is available for free on YouTube. I'll even link to it in the description. And even if you're one of those that doesn't really care about spoilers, I still recommend that you watch this film even after watching this video. Spoilers ahead. From the moment that the character of Will arrives in the story, the tone starts to shift. The seriousness of what John is saying begins to weigh on everybody differently. Either he's telling the truth or he needs help. When Will arrives to analyze John, he slowly gets more and more antagonistic until eventually he actually pulls a gun on John and threatens to shoot him to see if he's telling the truth. John calmly tells him that he is immortal but can still die, and that he would receive no answers if he killed him, so Will storms out angrily. It's then revealed that the reason that Will was so angry at John is because his wife had very recently passed away, leading Will to take offense to John's story about living forever. It's also revealed that the gun wasn't even loaded. This incident forces a change in the attitude of the other characters. If John is lying, he's seriously devoted to this deception if he's willing to get shot over it, or he is telling the truth. They continue to humor him, and the discussion slowly moves toward the idea of religion. Despite being open about every other subject, John wants nothing to do with this one.
We should skip this one.
No, skip it. Come on.
Next question.
No, come on.
You can't let
John.
you can't let this drop.
Come on, spit it out.
He immediately tries to deflect when they ask him if he knew any figures in religious history, or if he was a figure in religious history. That's when the realization comes as to why John is so reluctant to share this information.
I knew it. He's saying he was Christ.
Not everyone in the room is religious, but they're all taken aback by this claim, especially Edith, who is a devout Christian. John says that he inadvertently became the inspiration for the story of Jesus Christ. Everyone in the room is profoundly affected by this, as it shatters all of their worldviews at once. Suddenly it becomes clear that everyone does believe John, and because they do, they're afraid of what that will mean for the rest of their lives. This is my favorite scene in the entire movie, and I have my own interpretation of what Bixby was saying here. It's certainly my own, and I'm not sure if it was intended, but I find it fascinating. I think this scene is Jerome Bixby commenting on the nature of writing science fiction stories. What John is ultimately doing the entire time is telling a science fiction narrative. At first, everyone is entertained by it because it doesn't challenge them. Their beliefs aren't altered by what John has to say at first because they're humoring it as entertainment. No different than how general audiences view the majority of sci-fi. A story of a 14,000-year-old man isn't going to change their entire life until it does. When the characters encounter something that challenges them, they're frightened by it. It shocks them that this story that could be fictional could change the way that they think about the world around them forever. Bixby is commenting on why heavier science fiction like this doesn't get the attention that it should, because if a story truly has something to say that may make viewers look at things differently, they'll want to avoid it. This is what John is confronted with when Will returns to the story. He tells John that all of this has to stop and even threatens to have him committed for it. So, John makes his choice.
End of the line. Everybody off. It was a story. It was all a story.
John says that he made everything up, even giving evidence as to how he came up with his narrative through observations he made of everyone when they arrived. The reactions are mixed, to say the least. Edith is obviously relieved that her views on Christianity are no longer challenged. Dan is furious to the point of tears, Art leaves angrily, and Harry laughs the whole thing off. As the characters leave, Sandy tells John that she knows he was telling the truth the entire time, and just told everyone it was a hoax to make them all feel better. John and Sandy discuss the fake names that he's used throughout his life, saying one that Will recognizes. The name of his father, who he earlier said he never knew.
Your mother's name was Nola.
No.
Yeah.
No. Nola. My mother.
John is Will's father. Everything he said was true. The emotions that overcome Will are so strong that he has a heart attack and dies. This is the first time John has ever seen one of his children die. This makes him reconsider everything. His existence as a loner no longer feels right to him. The connections he's made to those around him are important to him now, and he comes to the realization that he can't go at it alone anymore. This is why the film ultimately ends with John deciding to take Sandy with him on his journey, wherever he may go next. The Man from Earth is an enthralling piece of dramatic sci-fi, one that uses the strengths of its writing to make up for its lack of budget and spectacle. And it's just so insanely underrated that if even one person watches it coming from my small YouTube channel, I'll be satisfied. Thank you all so much for sticking around through another video. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video.